After Isabella's confession, I didn't say a word. I just walked out. I drove around aimlessly for hours, replaying everything in my head. Her face, the way she cried, the way she tried to spin it like this was somehow my fault. And Robert, how could he do this to me? My own brother. When I got home that evening, Isabella was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red from crying. She immediately started in on how sorry she was, how it was a mistake, and how it didn't mean anything. I wasn't having it. I told her to pack a bag and leave. She looked stunned, like she didn't think I'd actually kick her out. But she must have realized I was serious because she started sobbing and saying, "Where will I go?" Like I cared at that point. "Go to him," I said. "You've been sneaking around with him for a year. I'm sure he'd love to have you." She tried to say that she didn't want to see Robert, that she wanted to work on us, but I wasn't buying it. She kept lying even as the truth was right in front of me. I told her if she didn't leave, I'd call Robert myself and tell him to come get her. That shut her up. She packed a bag and left without another word. After she was gone, I did what any sane person would do, I went through her phone. She hadn't taken it with her, and I guess she didn't think I'd look at it. Big mistake. I found texts, photos, even voice messages between her and Robert. They'd been meeting up at hotels, sneaking around when I was at work. There were texts where Robert joked about how clueless I was, how I never suspected a thing. It made me physically sick. One text from Isabella stuck out. It was sent just a week ago. "I hate lying to him. I feel like the worst person. But I can't lose you." Robert replied, "You're not lying. You're just protecting him. He'll never find out." Well, guess what? I found out. I didn't know what to do with myself after seeing all that. Part of me wanted to destroy the phone, smash it against the wall. But instead I started taking screenshots, emailing them to myself. I wasn't sure what I'd do with the proof, but I knew I needed it. Just in case. The next morning I called Robert. He answered like nothing was wrong, his usual cocky tone. "Hey Mike, what's up?" "What's up?" I said. "You tell me. How long have you been screwing my wife?" There was silence on the other end. Then he tried to laugh it off. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Robert. I know everything. I read the texts, saw the photos. Don't bother denying it." He stammered for a bit before finally admitting it. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said. "It just did. I never wanted to hurt you, Mike." I hung up on him. I couldn't listen to his excuses. By that afternoon, word had already spread through our family. Isabella must have called someone, maybe my mom, because my phone started blowing up with messages. My dad wanted to talk things out. My mom kept saying, "You need to forgive him. He's your brother. Forgive him. For stabbing me in the back." I couldn't take it. I shut my phone off and spent the rest of the day going through old photo albums and trying to figure out where it all went wrong. Every memory felt tainted now, our wedding, family holidays, even just random nights where we'd all hang out. Had they been laughing at me this whole time? Did they think I was that stupid? Later that night, Robert showed up at my door. I almost didn't answer, but I figured if he had the nerve to show up, I at least deserved to hear what he had to say. He stood there on the porch, looking like he hadn't slept. "Mike, I need to explain." "Explain what?" I said. "That you're a liar? That you've been screwing my wife for a year? What could you possibly say that would make this better?" He started rambling about how it wasn't serious between them, how it just happened because they were both feeling lonely. "Lonely?" I shouted. "You have me, Robert. I've always been there for you. And Isabella? She had me too. You weren't lonely, you were selfish." I told him to leave and never come back. He tried to push past me, saying we needed to fix this, but I shoved him back out the door. "The only thing that needs fixing is the part of me that trusted you," I said. Then I slammed the door in his face. That night, I realized I couldn't let this go. Not yet. They'd betrayed me in the worst possible way, and I wasn't about to let them walk away without consequences. If they wanted to destroy my life, they'd better be ready for the fallout. The day after I kicked Robert off my porch, my mom called me. Again. I'd been ignoring her, but this time she left a voicemail. "Michael, you need to come over. We need to talk as a family." I didn't want to go, but I figured they'd just keep pestering me until I did. So I drove over. The second I walked in, my mom pulled me into the living room where Robert was already sitting. He had that fake remorseful look on his face. My dad sat silently, arms crossed, clearly not thrilled about being dragged into this. "I don't want to be here," I said immediately. My mom started crying. "Michael, please. He's your brother. We can't let this tear the family apart." "Tear the family apart?" I snapped. "He did that when he slept with my wife." Robert tried to speak, but I held up my hand. "Don't even start. I'm not here for your apologies or excuses." But my mom wouldn't let it go. She kept saying we had to move past this, that family is family. I told her flat out, "If you want to forgive him, go ahead. But don't expect me to." I walked out before the conversation could go any further. As I was leaving, Robert followed me to the door. "I'll make this right, Mike," he said. "I promise." I didn't even look at him. "You can't fix this." That night, I sent Isabella and Robert an email with all the screenshots I had found. No message. Just the evidence. I wanted them to know I wasn't bluffing, that I knew everything. Isabella called me almost immediately, crying, begging me to talk. I didn't answer. Robert didn't reply at all. Coward. After I sent the email with the screenshots, Isabella called me within minutes. She was hysterical, saying she didn't know I had all that, begging me to let her explain. I ignored her. Her texts came in non-stop after that. "Please, Michael, I'll do anything to fix this. I don't even recognize myself anymore. This isn't who I am. I'll go to therapy, I'll do whatever it takes. Just please don't throw everything away." Throw everything away. She already did that the moment she chose Robert. Robert, on the other hand, stayed silent. No calls, no texts. Nothing. Typical. When things get tough, he hides like he's always done. Growing up, Robert was the golden boy, the charming twin, the one who got away with everything. I was the one who worked harder, cleaned up his messes. And now, here we are. I guess some things never change. By the next morning, my mom called again. She'd heard about the email. "Why are you doing this, Michael?" she asked, like I was the one who caused all this. "You're only making it worse by spreading this around." I couldn't believe her. Making it worse? They're the ones who did this. If you want to blame someone, blame them, not me. She sighed like I was some rebellious teenager. "You're both my sons. I can't take sides." "Well, then don't. But don't expect me to just forgive him because it's convenient for you." She hung up after that. The texts from Isabella kept coming. She even showed up outside my office that afternoon. I saw her standing by the front door through the glass. She looked like a wreck, hair unwashed, wearing the same sweatshirt I'd seen her in 2 days before. She kept pacing back and forth, biting her nails. One of my employees poked their head into my office. "Hey, there's a woman outside asking for you. Should I tell her to leave?" I shook my head. "No, I'll handle it." When I stepped outside, Isabella rushed over to me, tears streaming down her face. "Michael, please. I'm so sorry. I'm begging you to talk to me." I kept my voice low so no one inside could hear. "There's nothing to talk about, Isabella. You made your choice. I didn't choose this," she cried. I was confused. "Stop," I interrupted. "You don't get to play the victim here. You and Robert lied to me for over a year. You don't get to stand here and pretend this is anything but your fault." She grabbed my arm, her voice cracking. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Just tell me what you want." I looked her dead in the eye. "What I want is for you to leave me alone." Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment I thought she was going to walk away. But instead, she dropped to her knees right there on the sidewalk, sobbing. "Please, Michael. I love you. I can't lose you." People walking by started staring, and I felt a wave of second-hand embarrassment. I pulled her to her feet. "Go home, Isabella. This isn't the place for this. She hesitated but eventually walked away, still crying. As I watched her go, all I could think was how different she looked, like a stranger I didn't recognize anymore. 2 days after Isabella's meltdown at my office, Robert decided to make his move. He showed up at my house unannounced, like we were just going to have a casual chat about all this. I heard the knock, looked through the peephole and sighed. I didn't want to deal with him, but I knew if I didn't he'd just keep coming back. So, I opened the door. "What do you want, Robert?" I asked, my voice flat. He held up his hands like he was surrendering. "I just want to talk, Mike. Please. Talk? Like you talk to my wife behind my back." He flinched but didn't leave. "I know I messed up. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need to explain." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let him in. He walked into the living room, glancing around like he expected Isabella to jump out from behind a corner. "Say what you need to say," I told him, crossing my arms. He sat down on the couch, looking at his hands. For the first time in a long time, Robert didn't look cocky or smug. He looked scared. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he started. "It wasn't planned. It just got out of control." I laughed bitterly. "Out of control? You cheated with my wife for a year, Robert. That doesn't just happen." I know," he said quickly. "But it wasn't about you, Mike. It was never about hurting you." "Funny," I said, leaning against the wall. "Because it feels like it was entirely about hurting me." He sighed and rubbed his face. "I was jealous, okay? You've got this perfect life, your business, your house, Isabella. Everything I tried to build fell apart. I felt like a failure, and then, she was there. She understood what I was going through. So you decided to destroy my life because you couldn't handle your own." I snapped. "It wasn't like that," he said. "It was a mistake. I didn't know how to stop it." "You didn't want to stop it," I shot back. "Don't stand here and act like you're some helpless victim. You made your choices." Robert stood up, hands clenched at his sides. "I know I screwed up, Mike. But I'm still your brother. Doesn't that mean something?" For a second I just stared at him. "It meant something until you betrayed me. Now, you're nothing to me." He looked like I'd punched him in the gut, but I didn't care. "You need to leave," I said, pointing toward the door. "Mike. Get out, Robert." He stood there for a moment like he was going to say something else, but then he nodded and walked out. As the door closed behind him, I felt a strange mix of anger and sadness. He was my brother, but I couldn't see him as family anymore. After Robert left, I felt restless. I couldn't just sit there and stew in my anger anymore. I needed answers. I needed to know how far this went and if there were things I still didn't know. The texts I had already found were bad enough, but there were gaps, weeks where the messages between Isabella and Robert stopped completely. Were they careful enough to delete their conversations during those times? Or had they switched to meeting in person? I decided to hire a private investigator. It felt extreme, but at this point, I didn't trust either of them to give me the full truth. I wanted to know every lie they told, every time they met behind my back. I wanted the whole picture, no matter how painful. I met with the investigator the next morning at a small coffee shop. Her name was Rachel, and she didn't ask a lot of questions, just what I wanted to find out and what I had already discovered. I handed her printouts of the screenshots, along with details about Isabella and Robert's routines. She nodded, jotting notes in a small leather notebook. "How soon do you think you'll find anything?" I asked. "Depends," she said. "If they've been careless, I could have something in a week. If not, it might take a little longer." "Do whatever it takes," I told her. "I need the truth." Walking out of that meeting, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in days, I felt like I was doing something, taking control of the situation instead of just reacting to it. That night, though, my phone buzzed with a text from Isabella. She hadn't contacted me since her meltdown at my office, and I was tempted to block her number. But I opened the message anyway. "Michael, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to talk to you. Please. It's important." I stared at the message for a long time, debating whether to respond. Finally, I typed back, "What do you want?" Her reply came almost instantly, "I can't say it over text. Can we meet?" I hesitated. The last thing I wanted was to see her again, but a small part of me wondered if she was about to come clean about something I didn't know. "Fine," I replied. "Tomorrow. Noon. The park." The next day, I arrived at the park 10 minutes early. It was one of those crisp mornings where the air felt sharp, and the world was too quiet. I picked a bench under a tree, one where I could see anyone approaching from a distance. I didn't want to be caught off guard. Isabella showed up right on time. She looked different, smaller somehow, like the weight of everything was physically shrinking her. She had on a plain sweater and jeans, no makeup, and she was clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. She stopped a few feet away, waiting for me to say something. I didn't. I just gestured for her to sit. "Thanks for meeting me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want, Isabella?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. She flinched at my tone but didn't argue. "I wanted to tell you the truth. All of it. I know I've been lying and I've made everything worse. But I can't live like this anymore." I folded my arms and leaned back. "Go on then. Let's hear it." She hesitated, her eyes darting around like she was afraid someone might overhear. "It wasn't just a few times," she admitted finally. "Robert and it started before your birthday last year. I don't know how it happened, but it got out of control." I clenched my jaw, but I didn't say anything. She kept talking, her words tumbling out in a rush. I thought I could stop it, but every time I tried he'd say something and I didn't want to hurt you. And then I didn't know how to get out of it. I thought if I ended it quietly no one would ever have to know. "Right," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Because hiding it was so much better than coming clean." Tears started streaming down her face. "I didn't want to destroy our marriage, Michael. I never stopped loving you. I was just so lost." "Lost?" I repeated. "You didn't look lost in those texts. You looked like you knew exactly what you were doing." She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. Part of me felt bad for her, but another part, the bigger part, felt cold. Her tears didn't change anything. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked after a while. "Because I can't stand the idea of you hating me for the rest of your life," she whispered. "I know I can't fix this, but I need you to know that I regret everything. I wish I could take it all back." I stared at her for a long moment, trying to decide if I believed her. "Regret doesn't undo what you did, Isabella. It doesn't erase a year of lies." She nodded, wiping her face. "I know. I just wanted you to hear it from me. That's all." We sat there in silence for a few minutes. Finally, I stood up. "I've heard enough," I said. "Don't contact me again." I walked away without looking back. After the meeting with Isabella, I felt drained. It wasn't closure, it was just more of the same excuses and tears. Her regret didn't fix anything. Still, I was determined to keep moving forward. The private investigator, Rachel, had been working quietly in the background, and a few days later she called me with an update. "Michael, I've got something you're going to want to see," she said. We met at her office that afternoon. Rachel had a folder waiting for me on her desk. "This is just the first batch," she explained. "There's more I'm still piecing together, but this will give you an idea of what's been going on." I opened the folder, and the first thing I saw was a photo of Isabella and Robert entering a hotel together. The timestamp was from 6 months ago. There were more photos, different days, different hotels. One where they were standing in the parking lot, laughing. Another where Robert had his arm around her. It felt like someone had punched me in the gut. I thought I'd already seen the worst of it, but seeing them together like that, so casual, like they didn't have a care in the world, it hit differently. Rachel handed me a flash drive. "There's more on here. Emails, receipts, and some social media messages I was able to recover. I'll keep digging, but I think you'll find this pretty comprehensive." "Thanks," I said, my voice hollow. I didn't even know what I was thanking her for. The truth? It felt more like a punishment. When I got home, I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. The first thing I opened was a chain of emails between Robert and Isabella. They were from months ago, during a time when Isabella and I had been fighting about something small, who would pick up the groceries or something equally insignificant. In one email, Robert wrote, "Don't let him make you feel like this. You deserve better than the way he treats you." Isabella replied, "I just don't think he sees me anymore. He's so focused on work. Sometimes I feel invisible." There were dozens of messages like that. Robert positioning himself as her savior, Isabella pouring out her frustrations about me. It was like reading a script for some cliché affair. The receipts were just as damning. Hotel bookings, dinners, even flowers he'd sent her. One note attached to a bouquet read, "To my beautiful escape." My stomach churned. The final thing I opened was a message thread from a fake Instagram account Robert had apparently been using to contact Isabella. He was smart enough to avoid using his real profile, but Rachel had connected the dots. The messages were explicit, full of promises and plans for the future. In one, Robert talked about taking a trip together. Just you and me. Somewhere far away. No secrets, no lies. Just us. Isabella's response? "That sounds perfect. I wish we could do it now." I shut the laptop, my hands shaking. This wasn't just a fling, it was an entire relationship they'd built behind my back. They weren't just lying to me, they were living an entirely separate life together. I didn't know how to process it. Anger, sadness, humiliation, they all hit me at once. But beneath all of that there was something else: determination. They thought they could get away with this, that I'd just move on while they carried on with their lives. They were wrong. After digging through the evidence Rachel gave me, I knew I couldn't just sit back anymore. They'd taken so much from me, my marriage, my trust, my family, but I still had one thing they didn't: the truth. And I planned to use it. The first step was figuring out how to expose them. I didn't want to come across as bitter or reckless, but I also didn't want to let them off easy. They deserved consequences, and I was going to make sure they felt every single one of them. I started with my lawyer. I wanted to know exactly what my options were regarding a divorce. I wasn't naive, I knew Isabella might try to spin this in her favor. She could claim emotional abuse or say I'd been neglectful in the marriage. I needed to be prepared for any angle she might take. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Erin, laid it all out for me. "You've got a strong case for infidelity," she said after I showed her the evidence. "The courts will take this seriously. But we need to be careful about how we use this. If you go public with it before filing, it could backfire." "What about Robert?" I asked. "Can I sue him or press charges for interfering in my marriage?" Erin shook her head. "There's no legal action you can take against him directly. But if you want to ruin his reputation, that's another story." I nodded, already forming a plan. The next step was work. Robert and I weren't just brothers, we were also business partners. Our company, which focused on sustainable construction, had been my passion project for years. Robert joined me later, riding on the coattails of my success. Now, every time I thought about him sitting in our office pretending everything was fine while he was betraying me, I wanted to burn the whole building down. But instead of letting my emotions take over, I stayed calm. I called a meeting with our board of directors, presenting them with the evidence of Robert's actions, not the affair itself but his unprofessional conduct, his misuse of company resources for personal expenses, and his general lack of contribution to the business. It didn't take much to convince them. Robert had always been the charming face of the company, but everyone knew I was the one who did the real work. By the end of the meeting, the board had voted to remove him from his position. When Robert found out, he called me furious. "You went behind my back? Are you serious, Mike?" "Behind your back," I said, laughing bitterly. "That's rich coming from you. This isn't fair." He shouted. "You're punishing me for something personal. The business has nothing to do with it." "Oh, it has everything to do with it," I said. "You disrespected me, our family, and our company. You don't deserve to represent it anymore." He swore at me, calling me every name in the book, but I hung up before he could finish. I didn't have time for his tantrums. With Robert out of the company, I turned my attention back to Isabella. She was still sending me messages, alternating between apologies and attempts to justify her actions. I ignored most of them, but one caught my attention. "I need to see you," she wrote. "There's something I haven't told you, and it's important." I debated ignoring her, but curiosity got the better of me. If there was more to the story, I needed to know. So I agreed to meet her, this time at a neutral spot where I could control the situation. When we met, Isabella looked worse than the last time I'd seen her. Her eyes were hollow, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "Just get to the point," I said. She hesitated, looking down at her lap. "I think I might be pregnant," she whispered. The world seemed to tilt for a moment. "What?" I asked, my voice cold. "I don't know for sure yet," she said quickly. "But I thought you should know." "Is it mine?" The question came out before I could stop it. Her face crumpled. "I don't know," she admitted. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "When you figure it out, let me know," I said, my voice dripping with bitterness. "Until then, don't contact me again." I left without looking back, my mind racing. If she was pregnant, God, I couldn't even think about it. I needed time to process, to figure out my next move. A week after Isabella's bombshell about the pregnancy, she reached out again. This time it wasn't with desperation or excuses, it was with an answer. "I took a test," her message read. "I'm pregnant. I don't know what to do." I stared at my phone for what felt like an eternity. Part of me wanted to block her and move on, but another part, the part still tied to 12 years of marriage, couldn't ignore the possibility. If the baby was mine, I needed to know. I messaged her back, "We need a paternity test. That's the only way forward." To my surprise, she didn't fight me on it. "Okay," she replied. "Just tell me when and where." The next few days were a blur. I worked with my lawyer to set up everything legally. The test would be done through a clinic, and the results would be sent directly to me. Isabella agreed to the terms without hesitation, which almost made me suspicious. Why wasn't she fighting harder? Did she already know it wasn't mine? The day of the test was tense. We didn't speak as we sat in the waiting room. Isabella kept her head down, hands folded tightly in her lap. When her name was called, she stood without looking at me. The process was quick, just a swab for both of us. The clinic told me the results would take about a week. A week of wondering, overthinking, and preparing myself for whatever the outcome might be. During that time, I threw myself into work. With Robert gone, I had to pick up the slack, but I didn't mind. Staying busy kept my mind from spiraling. Still, every night when I went home, the weight of the situation hit me all over again. On the 6th day, I got the call. "Mr. Reeves," the nurse on the line said, her voice calm and professional. "The results are in. Would you like them over the phone, or would you prefer to come in?" "Just tell me," I said, gripping my desk so tightly my knuckles turned white. There was a pause, and then she said, "The results indicate that you are not the father." I exhaled, a mix of relief and anger washing over me. I thanked her and hung up, my hands still shaking. Isabella texted me not even an hour later. "Did you hear?" "Yes," I replied. "It's not mine." Her response came quickly. "I'm so sorry, Michael. I don't even know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," I wrote back. "This just confirms everything I already knew. We're done, Isabella. For good." I blocked her number after that. I didn't want to hear another word from her. As for Robert, I didn't bother telling him. If the baby was his, he'd find out soon enough. It wasn't my problem anymore. But even with the results in, I couldn't shake the anger. This wasn't just about the baby, it was about everything they'd taken from me. My trust, my stability, my sense of family. And I wasn't about to let them walk away without paying for it. After finding out the baby wasn't mine, I thought I'd feel relief, like I could finally move on. But instead, the anger settled deeper. It wasn't enough that I had proof of their betrayal. I wanted them to feel the fallout of their actions as much as I had. Robert was still avoiding me, which made things easier. He'd gone radio silent after I had him ousted from the company. Mutual friends told me he was laying low at a buddy's place, trying to figure out his next steps. Good. That gave me time to work without his interference. I started by focusing on Isabella. I knew she was staying with her parents, probably spinning a sob story about how I'd abandoned her after her mistakes. The thought made me sick. She always had a way of making herself the victim. But this time, I wasn't going to let her rewrite the narrative. I decided to send a carefully crafted letter to a select group of people, friends, family, even some of our old colleagues. In the letter I laid out the facts, the affair, the lies, the betrayal. I didn't embellish or add unnecessary drama. I just told the truth and included a few of the screenshots as proof. I didn't send it to everyone, just enough to make sure the truth couldn't be buried. Within days, the fallout started. Isabella called me from an unknown number, furious. "How could you do this to me?" she screamed. "You've ruined my life." "You ruined your own life," I said calmly. "I just made sure everyone knew the truth." She cried, begged, then threatened me, saying I was being cruel and vindictive. I didn't care. "You don't get to play the victim here, Isabella. You made your choices. Now you live with them." The next blow came for Robert. Through a friend in the industry, I found out he'd been applying for jobs, trying to get back on his feet. I made a few calls, sending the same evidence I'd shared with others. No one wanted to hire a man with a reputation for backstabbing and deceit. One by one, doors started closing for him. The word spread quickly: our industry is small and people talk. By the end of the week, Robert texted me for the first time since I kicked him out of the company. "You're ruining my life," his message read. "Good," I replied. A few days later I heard from our mom. She was frantic, saying I needed to stop what I was doing. "Michael, you've done enough damage. They're suffering. Can't you just let it go?" "No, Mom," I said firmly. "They didn't let me go when they lied to my face for a year. Why should I let them off easy?" She sighed, clearly at a loss. "You're better than this." "No, I'm not," I said. "Not anymore." And honestly, it felt good. After weeks of pulling strings and letting the truth spread, the fallout started to settle. Isabella had been forced to move back in with her parents, her social circle all but evaporated. The people she once considered friends kept their distance, and the ones who stayed only offered sympathy out of pity. As for Robert, his situation was even worse. He'd burned every professional bridge he had, and without a job or income, he was practically unhireable in our industry. From what I heard through mutual acquaintances, he was bouncing between cheap motels and the occasional friend's couch. The silence was finally broken one evening when Robert showed up at my house again. I'd been expecting it, but that didn't make it any easier to see him standing there, looking like a shadow of himself. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and the cocky smirk he used to wear was long gone. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice hollow. I let out a bitter laugh. "Talk? Now you want to talk?" "Please," he said. "I know I don't deserve it, but I need to say something." I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe. "Fine. Say it." He hesitated, looking down at his feet like a scolded child. "You were right about everything," he finally said. "I was selfish. I was stupid. And I ruined everything, for you, for me, for Isabella. And..." I prompted. "And I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I mean it. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I had to say it." I stared at him for a long moment, trying to gauge if he was being sincere or just desperate. "You're right," I said finally. "It doesn't fix anything. But I'll give you credit for finally admitting it." Robert nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know how to make it right, Mike. I don't think I can. I wish I could take it back." "You can't," I said bluntly. "And honestly, I don't care what you wish. You made your choices and now you're dealing with the consequences. That's life, Robert." He didn't argue. He just nodded again and turned to leave. As he walked away, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and maybe just a sliver of pity. But it wasn't enough to make me stop him. Later that night, my mom called me. "I heard Robert came to see you," she said cautiously. "Yeah," I replied. And nothing," I said. "He apologized. That's it." She sighed heavily. Michael, he's your brother. Don't you think it's time to start rebuilding? No, Mom, I said firmly. You don't just rebuild after something like this. Some bridges are meant to stay burned. She didn't push after that. After Robert's half-hearted attempt at an apology and my mom's relentless calls for reconciliation, I realized I needed space, not just from them but from the weight of everything they'd done. I decided to take a break from my routine and go somewhere no one could reach me. I packed a bag, booked a cabin up in the mountains, and drove out early the next morning. No emails, no texts, no distractions. Just me, a notebook, and the quiet. The cabin was tucked away in the woods, surrounded by towering trees and absolute silence. It was the kind of place where time slowed down and the air felt cleaner. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The first day, I just sat outside on the porch, staring at the view. The anger and bitterness I'd been carrying felt distant here, like they couldn't reach me. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't suffocating me either. I started writing in the notebook I brought, not really with a plan, just letting my thoughts spill out. At first it was just fragments, bits of conversations, feelings I couldn't shake, questions I didn't have answers to. Why didn't I see it sooner? Was it all my fault? What do I do now? But as I kept writing, the focus started to shift. I stopped obsessing over what they did to me and started thinking about what I wanted for myself moving forward. I didn't want to be the guy who let betrayal define him. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life looking back. By the second night, I was starting to feel like myself again. I made a simple dinner, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat by the fire. It was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a flicker of hope. But of course, the world doesn't let you stay in that peace for long. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I opened it. I know you don't want to hear from me, but I need to talk to you. Please, it's important. It was Isabella. I sighed, the peaceful mood from the cabin already slipping away. She wasn't going to stop, was she? For a moment I thought about ignoring it, letting the message sit there unread. But curiosity got the better of me. What could she possibly have left to say? Hey everyone. I never thought I'd be here typing all this out, but my life feels like it's falling apart, and I need to let it out somewhere. My name's Michael, I'm 40 years old, and until a few days ago I thought I had a pretty solid life. I'm a business owner, married to Isabella for 12 years, and I have a twin brother, Robert, who I thought I could trust with my life. The thing is, my 40th birthday was supposed to be this huge celebration. Isabella insisted on throwing a party for me at our home, inviting family, friends, and colleagues. She went all out with the decorations and the catering. It was perfect, or so I thought. People were laughing, drinks were flowing, and for a while I felt genuinely happy. I remember standing there, looking at Isabella, thinking, man, I'm lucky to have her. But something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it right away. Isabella kept disappearing into the kitchen, and every time I looked around, Robert wasn't far behind. At first, I thought nothing of it. They've always gotten along, and I was just glad they didn't hate each other like some in-laws do. But then, during a toast, I noticed something. The way Isabella and Robert glanced at each other wasn't just friendly, it was like they were sharing some inside joke I wasn't in on. It made my stomach turn, but I told myself I was being paranoid. It was my birthday, I shouldn't be ruining it with wild thoughts. After the party, most guests left, but Robert stuck around, saying he'd help clean up. Isabella told me to go relax in the living room, that they'd handle it. I agreed, but something didn't sit right. Maybe it was the drinks or just my gut, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. So, I stayed quiet and waited, listening from the hallway. And that's when I heard it. Isabella's voice, low but panicked, he can't find out, Robert. It'll destroy him. Then Robert, equally quiet but insistent, you need to calm down. We've kept it a secret this long. I felt my entire world collapse in that moment. I wanted to storm in there, demand answers, but I froze. I stood there, listening to my wife and my own brother talk about keeping it a secret. I didn't hear specifics, but it didn't take much to connect the dots. I went back to the living room before they noticed me. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying their words over and over in my head, trying to figure out what to do. The next morning I confronted Isabella. I didn't give her a chance to deny anything. I told her I overheard them and demanded the truth. At first she played dumb, acting like I was crazy. But when I wouldn't back down, she broke down and admitted it. She and Robert had been having an affair for over a year. A year. My wife and my twin brother. She tried to justify it, saying she felt unseen in our marriage, that she thought I cared more about work than her. And Robert? He was there for her when she needed someone. I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. He's my brother. He should have been there for me. That's enough for now. There's more to the story, what I've done since finding out what I plan to do next, but honestly I just needed to get this off my chest first. I can't believe this is my life now. I stared at Isabella's message for a long time. My initial instinct was to ignore it. After everything, what more could she possibly say that I hadn't already heard? But a part of me wanted closure, to hear her out one last time and finally put an end to this chapter of my life. So, against my better judgment, I replied, "Fine. What do you want?" She texted back quickly, "Can we meet? I just need a few minutes." I agreed, but on my terms. I chose a coffee shop far from my house, somewhere public but neutral. I didn't want her showing up emotional or trying to manipulate the situation. When she arrived, I barely recognized her. She looked pale and frazzled, her once pristine appearance replaced by someone who seemed weighed down by regret. She sat across from me, her hands trembling as she gripped a cup of tea she hadn't even touched. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just get to the point," I said flatly. She nodded, tears already welling up in her eyes. "I know I've hurt you in ways I can't even begin to fix, but I need you to know. I'm done with Robert. Completely. I told him I don't want anything to do with him anymore." I raised an eyebrow. "And what? You think that changes anything?" "No," she admitted. I've been doing a lot of thinking. About us, about everything I ruined. And I realized I never appreciated what I had with you. You were good to me, Michael. Better than I deserved." Her words sounded sincere, but I couldn't tell if they were genuine or just another attempt to pull me back in. "What do you want from me, Isabella? Forgiveness? A second chance?" She shook her head quickly. "No. I know I don't deserve that. I just needed to tell you that I'm sorry. Truly sorry. And that I hope, one day you can move on and be happy again." For the first time in months I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just a strange sense of finality. "I'm already moving on," I said simply. "And you should too." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Thank you for meeting me. I won't bother you again." I watched her leave, her figure disappearing into the crowd outside. For the first time I felt like I was finally free. The drive back to the cabin was quiet. No messages, no calls, just the sound of the road and the faint hum of the radio. When I got back, I stood on the porch and took a deep breath, letting the crisp mountain air fill my lungs. I wasn't fully healed, far from it. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't consumed by the pain of what they'd done. I still had a long way to go, but I was finally walking forward, leaving the past behind me. And as I stood there, staring out at the trees and the open sky, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let their betrayal define me. I deserved better. And I was going to build a new life on my own terms.